Some people don't lose everything overnight. They lose it slowly, until no one remembers who they used to be. The champagne glass slipped from Victoria Hale's hand and shattered softly against the polished marble floor, the sound barely louder than a breath. Yet somehow, it silenced the entire room, not because of the glass, but because of the woman standing at the entrance, a woman no one was supposed to notice, a woman no one believed belonged. Her coat was worn, the fabric thinning at the elbows, her shoes scuffed with miles of sidewalks, and her hair pulled back in a way that suggested practicality, not vanity. Beside her stood Ethan Cole, perfectly tailored in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most of the guests' monthly mortgages, his posture straight, his expression unreadable, as if he had just walked into a boardroom instead of his ex-fiancée's wedding. Whispers moved faster than the music, curling through the room like smoke. Is he serious? Who did he bring? Is she homeless? But Ethan didn't react. Not to the whispers, not to the stares, not even to Victoria's frozen expression at the altar. He simply stepped forward, slow and deliberate, as if every step had already been calculated. The woman beside him, Clara, didn't rush to keep up, didn't shrink under the weight of 100 judging eyes. She walked at her own pace, steady, calm, as if the room belonged to her in some quiet, unspoken way. 3 hours earlier, the sky had been gray and heavy with rain, the kind that soaked through clothes and settled into your bones. Ethan had been standing under the narrow awning of a coffee shop, staring at his reflection in the glass, not really seeing it, when he noticed her sitting on the curb across the street. She wasn't asking for money, wasn't calling out to anyone, just sitting there with a paper cup in her hands, watching the rain fall like it meant something. Most people would have looked away, and Ethan almost did, but something about the way she didn't look desperate, just present, made him pause. He crossed the street without thinking, the rain catching on his shoulders, his polished shoes darkening with each step. "You'll get sick sitting out here," he said, his voice flat, more observation than concern. She looked up at him then, her eyes clear, steady, not surprised, not grateful, just aware. "People always say that," she replied quietly, her voice soft but certain, "but they never stay long enough to find out if it's true." He handed her a hot coffee anyway, the heat curling into the cold air between them. She accepted it with a small nod, not a smile, not a thank you, just acknowledgement. He should have left after that, should have gone back to the rehearsal dinner he had no intention of enjoying, should have kept moving like he always did, but instead, he stayed. "Do you ever go back?" he asked after a moment, watching the rain slide down the street in thin silver lines. She tilted her head slightly, as if measuring the question. "Back to what?" "Places that decided you didn't belong," he said, his jaw tightening just enough to betray something beneath the surface. For a second, she didn't answer, just looked at him with a kind of stillness that made the noise of the city fade into the background. Then she said, "Sometimes, not to prove anything, just to remember who I was before they forgot." That was the moment something shifted, though neither of them named it. "I have a wedding to attend," Ethan said, almost like a challenge, "and I need someone who doesn't care what people think." She glanced down at the coffee in her hands, then back at him, her gaze unreadable. "No one truly doesn't care," she said. "They just decide what matters more." He nodded once, as if that answer was enough. "Come with me," he said. And now, standing at the entrance of a room filled with polished smiles and quiet judgments, Clara took one small step forward, her worn shoe pressing against marble that reflected chandeliers worth more than most. People's cars. She didn't look at the guests, didn't look at the bride, didn't even look at Ethan. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in details no one else noticed. The placement of silverware, the subtle shift in lighting near the stage, the way the staff moved around the edges like shadows. And then, almost imperceptibly, she reached out and adjusted a folded napkin on a nearby table, aligning it perfectly with the edge. A small, precise movement that didn't belong to someone who had been living on the streets. Ethan noticed. He didn't say anything, but for the first time that day, his expression changed. Not confusion, not curiosity, but recognition of something he couldn't yet name. Across the room, Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out thinner than she intended. "Ethan, what is this?" But he didn't answer. because for the first time since he walked in, he wasn't looking at his past. He was looking at the woman beside him, realizing, slowly, that he might not be the one who brought her into this room. She might be the reason he was meant to walk into it at all. The silence did not break all at once. It cracked slowly, like thin ice under careful steps, and every eye in the room shifted between Ethan and the woman beside him, searching for an explanation that refused to arrive. Victoria straightened her posture at the altar, her smile returning, but it was tighter now, stretched thin across something fragile. "You always had a sense of timing," she said, her voice carrying just enough lightness to pretend this was amusing, though her fingers tightened around the bouquet in her hands. Ethan did not respond, not immediately, and when he did, his voice was calm, almost distant. "I was invited," he said, as if that settled everything, as if nothing about this moment required justification. The guests laughed softly, uncertain, polite laughter that waited for someone to clarify the joke, but Clara did not laugh, did not even look in Victoria's direction. Instead, her attention drifted toward a table near the front, where an older man sat stiffly, his expression guarded, his suit immaculate but worn at the edges in a way that suggested it had been tailored years ago and carefully maintained ever since. Clara's gaze lingered there for a second longer than it should have. Then she began to walk, not toward the center of the room, not toward Ethan, but toward that table. The movement was subtle, but it shifted the energy again, like a quiet current pulling against the tide of expectation. Ethan watched her go, his brow tightening slightly, not in confusion, but in curiosity, as if he had just realized he was no longer leading this moment. "Sir," Clara said softly when she reached the table, her voice gentle but precise, the kind of tone that carried without needing volume. "You might want to adjust your cuff. It is folded inward." The man blinked, surprised, then glanced down at his sleeve. And she was right. He fixed it quickly, almost instinctively, then looked back at her with a sharper focus, studying her face as if trying to place something just out of reach. "Do we know each other?" he asked, his voice low, careful. Clara tilted her head slightly, the faintest hint of a smile touching her lips. "Not warm, not cold, just present. Not personally," she said. "But I have seen your work." The man's eyes narrowed just enough to signal interest, because that was not something people said casually, not in a room like this, not to him. Across the room, Victoria's composure began to slip, just a fraction, as she watched the interaction unfold without her control. "Ethan," she said again, sharper this time. "If you are here to make a point, you have made it." But he still did not look at her, because something else was happening, something quieter, more precise. Clara reached for the back of the empty chair beside the older man and adjusted it slightly, aligning it with the table in a way that seemed unnecessary, almost invisible, yet deliberate. The man noticed, and something in his expression changed, recognition flickering at the edges. "That is an unusual habit," he said slowly. "Most people would not notice something like that." Clara's fingers rested lightly on the chair for a moment before she let go. "Most people are not taught to," she replied. The music in the background faltered for a second, then continued, softer now, as if even the band sensed the shift. A woman at a nearby table leaned toward her companion and whispered, "Who is she?" But no one answered, because no one knew, and that uncertainty was beginning to feel heavier than the whispers that had filled the room before. Ethan took a step forward, just one, his attention fixed on Clara in a way that was no longer casual, no longer detached. He was watching her the way he watched a negotiation, the way he watched a deal unfold when he knew something important was about to reveal itself. "You said you had seen my work," the older man continued, his voice steadier now, more engaged. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Clara glanced at him, then at the table, then back at him again, her expression unchanged. "I mean that you prefer stability over risk," she said, quietly, "but you hide it behind aggressive language so people do not question your authority." The man's breath caught, just slightly, and for the first time since she approached him, he did not respond immediately. Around them, the room seemed to lean in, not physically, but in attention, as if every conversation had quietly paused without anyone realizing it. Victoria lowered her bouquet, her eyes fixed on Clara now, not with disdain, but with something closer to unease. Ethan exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, because in that moment, something became clear to him, something he had not expected when he offered a cup of coffee in the rain. He had not brought a stranger into this room. He had brought a question, and now that question was beginning to answer itself, one quiet sentence at a time. The man did not answer right away, and that silence said more than any denial could have, because men like him were used to filling space with certainty, not hesitation. His fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table, tapping once, then stopping, as if he had just realized he was being observed in a way he could not control. "That is a bold assumption," he said finally, but the edge in his voice had softened, replaced by something closer to caution. Clara did not react to the shift, did not press, did not retreat. She simply nodded once, as if acknowledging a fact that did not need to be defended. "It is not an assumption," she replied quietly. "It is a pattern." And that word lingered in the air, subtle, precise, the kind of word that belonged in boardrooms, not at a wedding reception. A few guests exchanged glances, their curiosity sharpening into something more focused. Because this was no longer a spectacle, it was becoming a conversation they did not understand but could not ignore. Ethan stepped closer now, not enough to interrupt, but enough to hear every word clearly, his attention narrowing, the rest of the room fading into background noise. "And what pattern would that be?" the man asked, leaning back slightly in his chair, testing, measuring. Clara's gaze shifted briefly to the glass of water in front of him, then back to his eyes, her movements unhurried, deliberate. "You invest in companies that look unstable," she said, "but only when you know they are about to be acquired by someone stronger." She paused, just a fraction, letting the thoughts settle. "You do not take risks, you position yourself next to them." The man's lips parted, then closed again, and for the first time, there was no immediate response, only recognition. A woman at the next table inhaled sharply, though she did not know why, only that something important had just been said. Across the room, Victoria's composure cracked further, her smile gone now, replaced by a stillness that felt heavier than any expression, because she was no longer watching a disruption. She was watching control slip away. "Who are you?" the man asked, more quietly this time. The question no longer casual, no longer polite. Clara did not answer, not directly. Instead, she reached for the napkin she had aligned earlier and smoothed it once more, a small, almost invisible gesture that carried a kind of familiarity that did not belong to her appearance. "Someone who remembers," she said, her voice steady. "Even when others prefer to forget." The man's eyes narrowed again, but this time not in suspicion, in recognition, as if a name was forming just out of reach. Ethan felt it too, that shift, that invisible line being crossed, and for the first time since he entered the room, he realized he was no longer anticipating what would happen next. He was waiting for it. A waiter passed by, slowing for a second longer than necessary, his eyes flicking between Clara and the man, sensing the gravity without understanding it. "You talk like you have been in the room before," the man said, his voice lower now, almost careful. Clara's expression did not change, but something in her eyes did, something quieter, deeper, like a memory surfacing just beneath still water. "I have," she said simply. The words did not rise, did not demand attention, yet they landed with weight, because they were not offered as a claim, but as a truth. The man leaned forward slightly, his focus sharpening. "Where?" he asked. But before Clara could respond, another voice cut through the moment, sharper, louder, carrying the authority of someone used to being heard. "That is enough," Victoria said, stepping down from the altar, her heels echoing against the marble floor, each step precise, controlled, but just a fraction too fast. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze fixed on Clara now, not dismissive, not amused, but searching, as if trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she believed. "You have made your entrance," she continued, her tone composed but tight. "But this is not your stage." Clara turned her head slightly, meeting Victoria's eyes for the first time, and in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them, something older than this moment, older than the room itself. Ethan saw it, even if he did not understand it, and the realization settled. Slowly, heavily, That this was never about a gesture, never about defiance, never about bringing someone unexpected into a familiar space. It was about something else entirely, something that had already begun long before he stepped into the rain. Victoria's words lingered in the air, sharp but carefully measured, the kind of control that came from years of being watched, admired, expected to never falter. Yet something in her voice betrayed a strain she could not fully hide. Clara did not respond immediately, and that silence stretched, not empty, but deliberate, as if she were allowing the weight of the moment to settle exactly where it needed to. Then she spoke, not louder, not softer, but with a clarity that carried across the room. Without effort. "I am not here for the stage," she said, her gaze steady. "I am here because this room remembers me differently than I remember it." A few guests shifted uncomfortably, their earlier amusement replaced by something less certain, something that did not fit neatly into conversation. Victoria's fingers tightened around her bouquet again, though she quickly adjusted her grip, smoothing the petals as if nothing had changed. "I think you are mistaken," she replied, her tone regaining its practiced composure. "We have never met." Clara tilted her head slightly, the faintest movement, but it carried a quiet contradiction. "You have," she said, and this time there was no pause, no hesitation, just a simple statement that did not ask to be believed. The older man at the table leaned forward, his attention locked on Clara now. "You said you have been in rooms like this before," he said slowly. "Then you understand what is at stake here." Clara glanced at him briefly, then back to Victoria. "Yes," she said, "that is why I came." Ethan felt something shift again, deeper this time, something that no longer resembled curiosity, but recognition of a story unfolding that he had not been invited to, only allowed to witness. A server passed by with a tray of champagne flutes, hesitating just slightly as the atmosphere thickened, unsure whether to continue or disappear. Clara's eyes moved across the room once more, not searching, not reacting, simply observing, until they landed on a framed photograph near the back wall, one that most guests had passed without noticing. A picture of a ribbon-cutting ceremony, years ago, faces younger, expressions brighter, the kind of image meant to capture success. She took a step toward it, slow, measured, her worn shoes barely making a sound against the marble floor, and for reasons no one could explain, several guests turned to follow her movement as if drawn by an invisible thread. Victoria noticed too, and for the first time, she moved without speaking, stepping down from where she stood and following at a distance, her heels clicking with controlled precision, though her pace had quickened just enough to betray urgency. Clara stopped in front of the photograph, her eyes scanning it with quiet familiarity, and then, almost absent-mindedly, she reached out and adjusted the frame, straightening it by less than an inch. A gesture so small it should have gone unnoticed, yet in that moment, it felt deliberate, intentional, as if restoring something that had been left slightly out of place for too long. "That was 10 years ago," Victoria said from behind her, her voice softer. "Now, less performative, more cautious. Our first expansion project." Clara nodded once, still looking at the photograph. "I remember," she said, and those two words carried a weight that did not belong to someone speaking from the outside. The older man stood up slowly from his table, his chair scraping lightly against the floor, his eyes fixed on the image now, then on Clara, then back again. "That project almost failed," he said, more to himself than to anyone else, until the restructuring plan was introduced. Clara turned slightly, just enough to meet his gaze. "Yes," she replied. "It was introduced the night before the final vote." The man's breath caught, barely perceptible, but enough, because that detail was not public, not something discussed openly, not something remembered by guests at a wedding. Ethan's gaze sharpened, his mind moving quickly now, connecting fragments he did not fully understand, yet could not ignore. Victoria's expression shifted. Again, this time not controlled, not measured, but uncertain. "That information is not something you would know," she said, her voice lower, tighter. Clara finally turned fully toward her, and for the first time, there was something in her eyes that resembled emotion, not anger, not bitterness, but something quieter, steadier. "It is," she said, "when you are the one who wrote it." And the room did not gasp, did not react all at once. It simply stilled, as if every person present had forgotten, for a single suspended moment, how to move, how to speak, how to pretend this was anything other than what it was becoming. Ethan did not look at Victoria, did not look at the guests, he looked only at Clara, and in that stillness, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. He had not brought her into a place where she did not belong. He had brought her back to a place that had once been hers. No one spoke at first, not because they did not want to, but because there are moments when truth enters a room so quietly that it takes time for people to recognize the sound of it. The older man's hand slowly lowered to his side, his gaze fixed on Clara with a clarity that replaced every trace of doubt. "That proposal," he said, his voice unsteady for the first time, "was never credited." Clara gave a small nod, not bitter, not proud, just acknowledging something long settled. "No," she said. "It was not." Across the room, a murmur began to rise, soft at first, then spreading, not laughter this time, not judgment, but confusion, recognition, something shifting beneath the surface of what everyone thought they understood. Victoria took a step forward, her heels no longer measured, her composure thinning with each second. "That is not possible," she said, though her voice had lost the certainty it once carried. "That work belonged to our firm." Clara turned her eyes to her, calm, steady, and for the first time, there was no distance in her voice, no softness to cushion the truth. It belonged to the person who stayed awake for 48 hours rewriting a collapsing structure while everyone else prepared their statements, she said. It belonged to the person who sat at that table when no one else believed it could be saved. The room seemed to contract around those words, as if space itself had tightened to hold them in place. Ethan felt it in his chest, that quiet pressure, not uncomfortable, but undeniable, like a realization settling deeper than logic. Victoria's lips parted slightly, then closed again, her eyes searching Clara's face as if looking for something familiar she had chosen to forget. "We would remember something like that," she said, softer now, almost to herself. Clara did not raise her voice, did not step closer. She simply said, "You did." And that answer did not accuse, did not demand. It only revealed. The older man let out a slow breath, his posture changing, not physically, but in presence, as if he were no longer standing in a wedding reception, but in a room where decisions had weight and memory mattered. "Whitmore," he said quietly, the name forming slowly, carefully, like something fragile being brought back into light. Clara Whitmore. A few guests repeated it under their breath, unsure, testing the sound, as if saying it might confirm what they were beginning to understand. Ethan's gaze sharpened at the name, because he had heard it before, not recently, not clearly, but enough to recognize that it belonged somewhere important. Victoria's expression shifted again, this time unmistakably, recognition breaking through the layers of denial she had held so tightly. "That is not," she began, but the sentence did not finish. Because the truth does not require permission to complete itself, Clara did not react to the name, did not correct it, did not claim it. She simply stood there, as she had from the beginning, unchanged by the room finally catching up to who she was. A guest near the back pulled out a phone, not to take a picture, but to search, to confirm, fingers moving quickly across the screen, and within seconds, others followed, quiet taps replacing whispers. The older man nodded slowly, his voice steadier now, grounded in certainty. "You disappeared," he said, "after the acquisition." Clara's eyes moved briefly, not away, but inward, as if acknowledging a chapter that had already been closed. "Yes," she replied. "I did." Victoria shook her head slightly, a small movement, but enough to reveal the unraveling beneath her composure. "That does not explain." She stopped again, because the explanation was no longer hers to control. Ethan took another step forward, closer now, not to intervene, not to protect, but to understand, because this was no longer about a disruption. It was about something far more precise, something that had been waiting to surface. "Why now?" he asked, his voice low, not demanding, just asking. Clara turned her gaze to him, and for the first time since they met in the rain, there was something warmer there, not soft, not fragile, but real. "Because," she said, "this was the room where I stopped being seen." She paused, just long enough for the words to settle, and I wanted to see if it would recognize me again. No one laughed this time. No one whispered, because the room was already answering her, not with words, but with silence, the kind that does not come from confusion, but from understanding too late. Ethan exhaled slowly, and in that breath, something shifted inside him, something quiet but irreversible, because he realized that this moment was not about proving anything, not about exposing anyone. It was about presence, about standing in a place that once erased you and choosing to exist there again without asking for permission. Clara's gaze moved once more across the room, not searching, not measuring, just observing. And then she stepped back, a single step, small, deliberate, as if returning the space to itself. She did not wait for acknowledgement, did not wait for apology, did not wait for anything at all. Because some people do not come back to reclaim what was taken. They come back to remind the world it was never theirs to lose. For a moment, no one moved, as if the room itself had been asked a question it could not answer quickly enough, and in that stillness, the smallest sounds became louder, the soft clink of glass, the faint hum of the air conditioning, the quiet shifting of weight from one foot to another. Clara did not wait for any of it to resolve. She simply turned, her movement unhurried, her posture unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all, as if she had only stopped by to straighten something that had been out of place and was now ready to leave. Ethan noticed first, not because she announced it, but because her absence had already begun to form before she even reached the door. "You are leaving," he said, not a question, just an observation spoken low enough that only she could hear. Clara paused, just for a second, then nodded once. "I did not come to stay," she replied, her voice quiet, steady. "I came to see." He studied her, searching for something, an explanation, a reason that would fit into the structure of the world he understood, but nothing about her fit into that structure anymore. "And did you?" he asked. She met his gaze, and there was no hesitation in her answer. "Yes," she said. "I saw enough." Behind them, the room had begun to stir again, not with laughter, not with ease, but with the slow, uncertain movements of people adjusting to a reality that had shifted without their permission. The older man stepped forward, his expression no longer guarded, but open, almost respectful. "Miss Whitmore," he said, using the name with care, as if acknowledging something he should have recognized sooner. "There are things that should be corrected." Clara glanced at him briefly, then shook her head, a small, almost gentle refusal. "They already are," she said. "Just not in the way you think." He opened his mouth to respond, but the words did not come, because he understood, perhaps for the first time, that correction did not always mean restoration, and recognition did not always require permission. Victoria stood a few feet away, unmoving, her bouquet lowered at her side, her expression unreadable now, not because she was composed, but because she no longer knew which version of herself to hold on to, the one that believed she had always been in control, or the one that had just realized control could be an illusion. "You could have said something," she said finally, her voice softer, stripped of its earlier sharpness. "Back then." Clara looked at her, not with accusation, not with regret, but with a calm that felt almost distant. "I did," she replied. "You just did not need to hear it." The words were not harsh, but they landed with a quiet finality that left no space for argument. Ethan exhaled slowly, his mind catching up to something his instincts had already accepted. "You are not who I thought you were," he said, and this time it was a question, though it did not sound like one. Clara gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile, not amused, not proud, just acknowledging the truth of it. "No," she said, "I am not." Then she added, after a brief pause, "But neither are you." The words settled between them, not as a challenge, but as a mirror, reflecting something Ethan had not fully considered until now. He looked at her, really looked this time, not at the coat, not at the worn edges, but at the stillness, the clarity, the quiet certainty that did not ask for validation. "What happens now?" he asked, and for the first time since the evening began, there was no strategy in his voice, no calculation, only curiosity. Clara turned slightly toward the exit, her hand resting lightly on the door handle. "Now," she said, "you go back to your life." She paused, just long enough for the words to settle. And decide if it still fits. She opened the door, the outside air slipping into the room in a soft, cool breath, carrying with it the faint scent of rain that had not fully left the city. For a second, she stood there, framed by the doorway, neither inside nor outside. And then she stepped forward, disappearing into the quiet. Beyond without looking back. The door closed gently behind her, the sound soft, almost unnoticed, yet it marked something clear, something complete. Inside, the room remained, the guests, the lights, the ceremony waiting to continue, but nothing felt the same, because sometimes a single presence does not change the setting. It changes the meaning of everything within it. The door had already closed, yet the air she left behind refused to settle, lingering in the room like a question no one had prepared to answer. And for several long seconds, no one resumed their role, not the guests, not the musicians, not even the officiant who still stood at the front as if waiting for a signal that never came. Ethan remained where he was, his gaze fixed on the door, not because he expected it to open again, but because something in him had not followed her out. Something still stood in that threshold, suspended between what he had been and what he was beginning to understand. A glass clinked somewhere in the background, too loud for the silence that followed, and the room shifted, not back to normal, but forward into something uncertain. Victoria inhaled slowly, lifting her chin just enough to reclaim a version of control, though her eyes betrayed the effort. "We should continue," she said, her voice steady, practiced, but missing the ease it once carried. And the officiant nodded quickly, grateful for direction, beginning again with words that now felt distant, almost hollow. Guests adjusted in their seats, smoothing jackets, straightening posture, performing normalcy as if it could be restored by repetition alone, but their eyes kept drifting, not toward the altar, but toward Ethan. He noticed, of course he did. He always noticed, but this time he did not respond, did not offer a reassuring expression or a polite distraction. He simply stood there, still, present, and for the first time in a long time, not in control. The older man remained near the table, his attention no longer on the ceremony, but on Ethan, as if recognizing in him the same shift that had already taken place in the room. "You knew," he said quietly, not accusing, just asking. Ethan turned his head slightly, meeting his gaze, and after a brief pause, he shook his head once. "No," he replied, his voice calm. "I did not." The man studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if that answer mattered more than any explanation. At the front, Victoria's hands trembled just enough for the movement to be visible only to those closest to her, her fingers tightening around the bouquet again, though this time she did not adjust it, did not correct the gesture. She simply held on. The words of the ceremony continued, vows spoken, promises made, but something had shifted in their meaning, not because the words had changed, but because the room had. Ethan's gaze moved slowly from the altar to the photograph on the wall, then to the table where Clara had stood, then back again, tracing the path she had taken as if mapping something he had not seen before. He exhaled quietly, and in that breath, a decision began to form, not sudden, not dramatic, but steady, like something that had been waiting beneath the surface for longer than he realized. The officiant asked a question, one that required an answer, and Victoria responded, her voice clear enough to carry, though it no longer held the certainty it once did. The groom followed, his tone confident, unaware, or perhaps choosing not to acknowledge what had just unfolded. Applause came at the expected moment, polite, measured, but it lacked the fullness it should have carried, because something essential had already left the room. Ethan did not clap, not out of defiance, but because his hands remained still at his sides, his attention elsewhere, beyond the ceremony, beyond the expectations that had once defined him. A server approached cautiously, offering a glass of champagne, and Ethan accepted it without looking, his fingers wrapping around the stem with practiced ease. Yet he did not raise it, did not drink. He simply held it, as if waiting for the right moment to decide what it meant. The music swelled again, louder now, filling the space that silence had claimed, and guests began to stand, to move, to speak. The rhythm of the event reasserting itself, but beneath it, something quieter remained, something that could not be undone. Ethan took a step forward, then another, not toward the altar, not toward the celebration, but toward the exit, his movement slow, deliberate, mirroring the path Clara had taken moments before. No one stopped him, no one called out, because, in that moment, everyone understood, even if they could not explain it, that he was not leaving the event, he was leaving something else entirely. His hand reached for the door, pausing for just a second on the handle, and in that brief stillness, he saw it clearly, not her face, not her words, but the quiet certainty in the way she had walked away, as if she had nothing left to prove and nothing left to reclaim. He opened the door, and the cool air met him again, carrying the faint trace of rain, and without looking back, he stepped outside, not knowing where he was going, but knowing, for the first time in a long time, that he was no longer staying where he had been. The night air felt different the moment he stepped outside, not colder, not warmer, but clearer, as if something that had been pressing against his chest inside had finally loosened without asking permission. Ethan paused just beyond the doorway, the sound of music fading behind him, replaced by the distant hum of the city, steady, indifferent, real. For a second, he did not move, not because he was unsure, but because he was adjusting, recalibrating to a silence that no longer felt empty. He glanced down the street, the pavement still slightly damp from earlier rain, reflecting the soft glow of streetlights in broken lines of gold. She was not immediately visible, and that absence should have ended the moment, should have closed the chapter neatly. But something in him refused to accept that this was where it stopped. He stepped forward, his polished shoes meeting the wet sidewalk, the sound softer now, less defined, as if even that detail had changed. A few yards ahead, near the corner, he saw her, not walking quickly, not disappearing into the distance, just moving at the same steady pace she had carried all evening, as if time did not rush her the way it rushed everyone else. He did not call out right away, not because he hesitated, but because he understood, instinctively, that whatever this was, it did not begin with interruption. Instead, he closed the distance quietly, each step measured, until he was close enough that his presence could be felt without needing to be announced. "You did not go far," he said finally, his voice calm, carrying through the open space without force. Clara slowed, then stopped, turning slightly to face him, her expression unchanged, as if she had expected him eventually, just not sooner or later. "I was not trying to leave," she replied, her tone steady. "Just to step outside of it." He nodded once, understanding more than he could explain. "So was I," he said. For a moment, they stood there, not speaking, not filling the space, just sharing it. The city moving around them without interruption, cars passing, lights shifting, life continuing as if nothing significant had happened, even though something had. "You knew I would follow," he said after a while, not accusing, not assuming, just stating what felt obvious now. Clara's gaze drifted briefly toward the street, then back to him. "I thought you might," she said, "but I did not need you to." The distinction was small, but it landed clearly, and Ethan felt it, not as rejection, but as clarity. He studied her for a moment, really studied her, the worn coat, the quiet posture, the absence of anything performative, and then something else beneath it, something that no longer required confirmation. "Why did you disappear?" he asked, not abruptly, but carefully, as if the question itself deserved respect. Clara did not answer immediately, her eyes shifting slightly, not away, but inward, as if passing through a memory she had already made peace with. "Because staying would have meant becoming someone I was not," she said, her voice even. "And leaving meant losing everything they thought I was." She paused, just a fraction. "I chose the second." Ethan exhaled slowly, absorbing the weight of that choice, because he understood what it meant to build something, but not what it meant to walk away from it without trying to reclaim it. "And now?" he asked, his tone quieter, more grounded. Clara looked at him, and this time, there was something different in her expression, not warmer, not softer, but more open, as if the question itself had shifted something. "Now I am not trying to be remembered," she said. "I am just trying to be accurate." The word lingered, precise, intentional, and Ethan felt it settle somewhere deeper than logic. He glanced back briefly toward the building, the lights still bright, the music still playing, the life he had just stepped out of continuing without pause, and for the first time, it felt distant, not physically, but in meaning. You changed that room, he said, turning back to her. Without asking anything from it, Clara gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. No, she replied. The room changed itself, she added quietly. I just stood where it could not ignore me anymore. Ethan let out a quiet breath, something between a realization and an acceptance, and for a moment, neither of them spoke again. The city moved. The lights flickered. The night continued, but something had shifted, not around them, but within them, something that did not need to be named to be understood. And in that quiet, standing on a damp sidewalk under soft streetlights, Ethan realized that for the first time in a long time, he was not trying to lead the moment, not trying to define it. He was simply in it, and somehow, that felt more real than anything he had left behind inside. The silence between them did not feel empty. It felt complete, like a conversation that did not need to be finished with more words. And yet something remained, something that had not been asked, not because it was hidden, but because it required a different kind of attention. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the damp pavement reflecting the faint movement of his polished shoes, and for a moment, he looked at her not as a mystery, not as a disruption, but as a person who had already made choices he had not yet learned how to consider. You said you chose to leave, he began, his voice steady. But you never tried to come back. Clara did not look surprised by the question, as if she had heard it before, not from him, but from the world in different forms. She glanced briefly at the streetlight above them, its glow soft and constant, then back at him. Coming back is not always about returning, she said. Sometimes it is. About refusing to become what they expect when you do. He nodded slowly, absorbing the distinction, because it was not the kind of answer that fit into the structures he was used to. It was something quieter, more exact. A car passed by, its headlights sweeping across them for a second, illuminating the worn edges of her coat and the sharp lines of his suit in the same light, the contrast visible, but less important than it had been before. You could have rebuilt everything, he said after a moment, not as a challenge, but as a statement grounded in his own experience. With your mind, your work, you could have walked into any firm and started again. Clara's lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but into something that acknowledged the truth without agreeing with it. Yes, she said. I could have. She paused, then added. But it would have been their version of me, not mine. The words settled between them, clear, deliberate, and Ethan felt the weight of them in a way that surprised him. He had spent years building, expanding, refining, always moving forward. But never once had he questioned whether the version of himself he was building belonged to him or to the expectations around him. So you chose to disappear, he said, quieter now. Clara shook her head gently. No, she replied. I chose to stop performing. The distinction was small, but it shifted everything, and Ethan felt it, not as a concept, but as a realization that moved through him slowly, changing the way he understood his own path. He glanced down the street again, the city stretching out in both directions, full of movement, full of people, full of lives that continued without pause, and for the first time, he wondered how many of them were still performing roles they no longer questioned. And today, he said, turning back to her, was that a performance? Clara met his gaze, steady, direct, and for a second, the noise of the city seemed to fade again, not because it stopped, but because it no longer mattered. No, she said. Today was an interruption. He exhaled softly, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it, only recognition. You interrupted everything, he said. The ceremony, the people, the version of reality they were holding on to. Clara gave a slight nod. Only because it was already unstable, she replied. I did not break anything. I just removed what was covering it. Ethan considered that, the idea settling into place with a clarity that felt both unsettling and necessary. He thought of the room, the photograph, the way people had shifted when the truth surfaced, not resisting it, but adjusting to it too late. And what about me? He asked, the question coming more quietly than the others, not driven by curiosity alone, but by something closer to honesty. Clara looked at him for a moment, longer this time, as if measuring not the question, but the person asking it. You did not interrupt anything, she said. You stepped out of it. The words landed differently, not sharp, not heavy, but precise, and Ethan felt the difference immediately. He had not exposed the room, had not changed it. He had simply chosen not to remain inside it. The realization was subtle, but it shifted something fundamental. And now? He asked again, though the question had changed, no longer about direction, but about meaning. Clara glanced toward the street ahead, then back at him, her expression calm, unchanged. Now you decide if stepping out was a moment, she said, or a pattern. The word echoed, familiar now, carrying the same quiet weight it had inside the room. Ethan stood there, the city moving around him, the night continuing as it always did, but something in him had slowed, not in hesitation, but in awareness. He did not answer right away, not because he could not, but because for the first time, the answer did not feel like something to say, it felt like something to become. The word stayed with him long after she said it, not loud, not demanding, just present, like something placed carefully in his hands without instruction, and Ethan did not move right away, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that movement now meant something different than it had before. The city continued around them, steady and indifferent, headlights passing, footsteps echoing faintly on the sidewalk, distant conversations blending into a quiet hum. But none of it pulled him away from the moment. A pattern, he repeated softly, not asking, just testing the shape of it. And Clara gave a small nod, as if confirming something he already knew. Most people mistake moments for change, she said, her voice calm. But patterns are what remain when the moment is gone. Ethan looked back toward the building again, the lights spilling out from the tall windows, the movement inside barely visible now, reduced to shadows and silhouettes. And for a second, he could almost see himself still there, standing in the same place, holding the same glass, waiting for something to tell him what came next. I built everything on patterns, he said after a while, his tone thoughtful, quieter than before. Market patterns, behavior patterns, risk patterns. He paused, then added, I never thought about my own. Clara listened without interrupting, her posture still, her attention complete, the kind that did not rush to respond. Because yours worked, she said, not as praise, not as critique, just as a fact, until they did not. Ethan let out a breath that almost resembled a laugh, though there was no humor in it, only recognition. And how do you know when they stop working? He asked, turning back to her. Clara glanced down the street, watching a car slow at the corner before continuing, then looked back at him. When they require you to ignore something you can already see, she said, and the answer settled immediately, because he knew, he had known, even before tonight, even before the room, even before the invitation that had not made sense until now. He thought of the way he had walked into that wedding, not out of celebration, not out of closure, but out of habit, out of a pattern he had never questioned, one that kept him moving forward without asking why. And you? He asked, his voice softer now, more grounded. How did you know when to leave? Clara did not hesitate this time, her answer already clear. When staying started to feel like pretending, she said, and leaving felt like losing everything except myself. Ethan nodded slowly, the weight of that distinction settling into something deeper than understanding. A light breeze moved through the street, lifting the edge of her coat slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and something quieter beneath it, something clean, unfinished. You walked away from everything, he said, not questioning, just acknowledging. Clara met his gaze, steady as always. No, she replied. I walked towards something I could not see yet. The words shifted the perspective again, subtle but complete, and Ethan felt it. The difference between leaving and moving toward, between absence and direction. He looked down at his hands for a moment, empty now, no glass, no object to hold, nothing to anchor him to the version of himself that had existed just hours ago. And if I go back inside, he said slowly, choosing each word with care, what happens then? Clara watched him for a second, not judging, not guiding, just observing. Then nothing changes, she said, because you will know what you saw and choose not to follow it. The clarity of it left no room for interpretation, no space for comfort. Ethan exhaled again, longer this time, as if something inside him had reached its limit and was now settling into a different shape. He turned his head once more toward the building, the lights, the movement, the life that had once felt certain, and, for a moment, he stood there, suspended between two versions of himself, one familiar, one undefined. Then he looked back at Clara, not searching, not questioning, just present. "And if I do not go back?" he asked. Clara's expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened, just slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Then you begin," she said. The word did not sound dramatic, did not carry weight in the way most beginnings do. It was simple, quiet, almost understated, and yet it landed. With more certainty than anything else that had been said. Ethan nodded once. Not because he had decided everything, not because he understood the path ahead, but because he recognized the truth of the moment, the difference between knowing and choosing. He glanced down the street again, not searching for direction, but acknowledging that it existed, that it always had, and without another word, he took a step forward. Not away from something, not towards something specific, but into something that no longer required explanation, because for the first time, the path was not defined by where he had been, but by what he was no longer willing to ignore. He did not look back again, not because the past no longer existed, but because it no longer held the same authority over him. And as Ethan walked forward, the rhythm of his steps began to settle into something quieter, less driven by urgency, more guided by awareness. Clara remained beside him for a few moments, matching his pace without effort, her presence steady, unchanged, as if she had already arrived somewhere he was only beginning to understand. The street stretched ahead, lined with dim storefronts and muted reflections, the kind of city view most people passed without noticing. Yet tonight, it felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. "You are not trying to lead anymore," Clara said after a while, her voice calm, observational, and Ethan let out a soft breath, almost surprised by the accuracy of it. "I do not know what I am doing," he admitted, not as weakness, but as fact, and the words felt unfamiliar, yet lighter than anything he had said inside. "That room," Clara nodded slightly. "That is usually where it starts," she replied. They continued walking, the distance between them and the building growing, not dramatically, but enough that the music had faded completely, replaced by the quiet consistency of the city at night. A small diner stood on the corner ahead, its windows lit with a soft, warm glow, a contrast to the polished brightness he had just left behind. Without thinking, Ethan slowed, his gaze drawn to the simplicity of it, the worn booths, the handwritten menu taped near the counter, the quiet presence of people who were not performing anything beyond being there. Clara noticed, though she did not comment right away. "You see it differently now," she said eventually, and he nodded, his eyes still on the reflection in the glass, not of himself, but of the space, the kind of place he would have passed without a second glance before. "It feels real," he said, searching for the right word, knowing it was not perfect, but close enough. Clara stepped closer to the window, her reflection faint against the light inside. "It always was," she said. "You just did not need it to be." Ethan let that settle, the idea that reality had not changed, only his relationship to it had. A bell above the diner door rang softly as someone exited, the sound simple, unremarkable, yet grounding in a way he could not explain. He glanced at Clara, then back at the door, and for a second, the choice in front of him felt smaller than the ones he was used to making, and yet somehow more significant. "Do you ever go inside places like that?" he asked, his tone lighter now, less burdened by expectation. Clara gave a small nod. "Sometimes," she said, "when I want to remember what nothing looks like." He frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in curiosity. "Nothing," he repeated. She met his gaze, her expression steady. "Nothing that needs to be proven," she clarified, and the simplicity of it struck him in a way that lingered. He looked back at the diner again, the quiet movement inside, the absence of anything that required performance or validation, and for the first time, the idea of stepping into a space without purpose, without strategy, felt unfamiliar, yet possible. "I used to think everything had to lead somewhere," he said, almost to himself. Clara tilted her head slightly. "And now?" she asked. Ethan paused, considering the question not as something to answer quickly, but as something to understand fully. Now I think, maybe it is enough to just be somewhere, he said, and the words felt tentative, but true. Clara's expression shifted, just slightly. Not into approval, not into agreement, but into recognition, as if he had reached a point she already knew existed. They stood there for a moment longer, the diner light casting a soft glow onto the sidewalk, the city continuing its quiet rhythm around them. And then Clara took a small step back, not away, but enough to create space, the kind that allows a choice to become visible. "This is where I stop walking with you," she said, her voice gentle, but clear. Ethan looked at her, not surprised, but aware that this moment had always been approaching. "Because I need to decide what happens next," he said, more to himself than to her. Clara nodded once. "Because you already can," she replied. He studied her for a second longer, the person who had walked into a room and changed it without asking, then walked out without waiting for anything in return, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to follow, not because he did not want to, but because he understood that this part was his. "Will I see you again?" he asked, the question simple, without expectation. Clara gave a faint smile, barely there, but real. "You will know where to look," she said, and with that, she turned, her steps quiet, steady, disappearing into the same city that had always been there, just unseen. Ethan remained where he was, standing between the soft glow of the diner and the fading echo of the life he had left behind. And after a moment, he reached for the door, not because he had to, not because it led somewhere important, but because for the first time, the act of choosing it was enough. The bell above the diner door rang softly as Ethan pushed it open, the sound simple, almost unnoticed, yet it marked something clear, something chosen. The warmth inside met him immediately, not overwhelming, not artificial, just steady, the kind of warmth that did not try to impress anyone. A few heads turned briefly, then returned to their meals, their conversations, their quiet routines, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt what it was like to enter a room where no one was waiting for him to be anything other than present. He paused just inside the doorway, taking in the details without rushing, the worn edges of the counter, the low hum of a coffee machine, the soft clink of silverware against ceramic plates. None of it demanded attention, and yet all of it held it. A waitress behind the counter glanced up, her expression neutral but not distant. "Sit anywhere you like," she said, her voice casual, and Ethan nodded once, moving toward a booth near the window. The seat was slightly worn, the table marked with faint scratches from years of use. And as he sat down, he noticed something he would have missed before, the way everything here carried history without trying to hide it. He rested his hands on the table, empty, still, not reaching for a phone, not checking anything, just there. The waitress approached with a pot of coffee, pouring it into a simple white mug without asking, the steam rising in soft curls. Between them, "Long night?" she asked, not probing, just observing. Ethan glanced at the cup, then back at her, and for a second, he considered the question, not as something to answer automatically, but as something to understand. "Something like that," he replied, his voice quieter than usual, not guarded, just real. She gave a small nod, leaving the pot on the table. "Coffee is on the house if you need it," she said, then moved on, not waiting for a response. Ethan watched her go for a moment, then looked back at the mug, the surface of the coffee still, reflecting the overhead light in a way that felt almost grounding. He picked it up slowly, the warmth settling into his hands, and as he took a sip, the simplicity of it struck him, not remarkable, not exceptional, just honest. Outside, the street continued its quiet movement, lights passing, shadows shifting, but inside, everything felt contained, steady. Enough. He leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting to the window, and, for the first time that night, his thoughts did not rush ahead of him, did not try to solve or predict, they simply followed what had already happened. Clara's words returned, not as echoes, but as something present, something that did not fade with distance. And he realized that nothing about this moment required him to prove anything, not to the room he had left, not to the people who had watched, not even to himself. He set the cup down gently, the sound soft against the table, and let out a slow breath, one that did not carry tension, only release. A man in the next booth laughed quietly at something his companion said, a sound that did not demand attention, yet felt more real than the applause he had heard earlier. Ethan glanced over briefly, then back to the table, and something settled in him, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, like something finding its place after being out of alignment for too long. He did not reach for his phone, did not check the time, did not consider what he should be doing next. Instead, he sat there, in a booth that did not belong to him, in a moment that did not need to lead anywhere, and allowed himself to exist without direction for the first time in years. The door opened again behind him, the bell ringing softly, and he did not turn to see who entered, not because he did not care, but because for once, he did not feel the need to track everything around him. He lifted the cup again, taking another sip, and as he did, he understood something simple, something that had been there all along but had never been clear enough to hold on to. Sometimes, the most important change does not look like progress. It looks like stillness, like choosing to remain where you are without needing it to become something else. And in that quiet diner, under soft lights and the low hum of ordinary life, Ethan did not feel lost. He felt accurate, as if for the first time, the version of himself sitting there matched the one he had been too busy to notice. The coffee had gone slightly cooler by the time Ethan noticed it, not cold, not untouched, just settled, like everything else around him. And he realized he had not been measuring time the way he used to, not in minutes or schedules, but in moments that did not need to be counted. The diner remained the same, the quiet hum of conversation, the soft clatter of dishes, the steady rhythm of something that did not depend on him. And for the first time, that absence of importance did not feel like loss. It felt like relief. He traced the rim of the cup lightly with his fingers, not thinking, not calculating, just present in a way that had once seemed unproductive, and yet now felt more precise than any plan he had ever executed. The waitress passed by again, refilling his cup without asking, her movements simple, efficient, and he nodded slightly in thanks, a gesture that required no performance, no expectation, just acknowledgement. Outside, the city lights continued to reflect against the glass, shifting with passing cars, but inside, nothing rushed, nothing demanded, and that contrast no longer pulled him in two directions, it simply existed. He thought of the room he had left, the polished floors, the controlled smiles, the weight of expectation carried in every glance, and for a moment, he did not judge it, did not reject it. He simply saw it for what it was. A place that required a version of him he no longer felt the need to maintain. Clara's presence lingered, not as a memory that faded, but as something that had adjusted the way he saw everything else, a quiet recalibration that did not announce itself, yet changed every detail. He did not know where she was now, did not try to imagine it, because for the first time, knowing was not necessary. A man near the counter paid his bill, leaving a few dollars beside his plate, a small gesture, unnoticed by most. Yet it carried a kind of completeness, a beginning and an end contained in a simple act. Ethan watched it without thinking, then looked back at his own table, the empty space beside his cup, the absence of anything unfinished, and something in him recognized the same completeness. He reached into his jacket, pulling out his wallet, placing cash on the table, not as a transaction, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the space he had occupied. He stood slowly, not rushed, not delayed, just moving when it felt accurate. And as he did, he glanced once more around the diner, not memorizing it, not holding on to it, just seeing it clearly before stepping away. The bell above the door rang again as he exited, the sound soft, familiar now, and the night air met him once more, cool and steady. The city stretched out in front of him, not offering direction, not demanding decision, simply existing as it always had, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to define where he was going next. He stepped onto the sidewalk, the pavement still carrying traces of earlier rain, reflecting light in quiet fragments, and paused for a moment, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that movement now came from something different, something that did not need urgency. He looked down the street, then in the opposite direction, both paths equally open, equally undefined, and for once, that did not feel like uncertainty, it felt like freedom. Clara had said he would know where to look, and standing there, he realized she had not meant a place, she had meant a way of seeing. Something that did not depend on finding her again, but on recognizing what had already changed within him. He took a breath, steady, unforced, and began to walk, not towards something specific, not away from anything at all, just forward, with a pace that matched his own. Understanding rather than the expectations of anyone else. The city moved with him, not ahead, not behind, just alongside. And for the first time, he did not feel like he was chasing it or being pulled by it. He felt aligned with it, present within it. And as he disappeared into the quiet rhythm of the night, there was no dramatic ending, no final resolution, only a simple, steady truth that remained long after the moment had passed. That sometimes, the most powerful transformation is not when the world sees you differently, but when you no longer need it to.